Hey everybody, this is Russ from Retro Gamecore. Today we're going to review this mini PC right here. This one is called the DroiX Proteus 11. Now you may have heard of this company, DroiX, before because they're a reseller of a bunch of different mini PCs and retro gaming handhelds and things like that. But this is the first mini PC that I've reviewed from this company. And it has a few unique aspects to it. First and foremost are these Wi-Fi antennas. I have a hunch that these are going to be really great if you don't have access to an Ethernet cable wherever you're going to have this mini PC. And so in this video, we're going to take this little computer through the ringer. I'm going to focus mostly on PC gaming and retro game emulation, and we'll check to see whether or not the performance matches the price. And so without any further delay, let's jump right into it. Okay, to start, let's go over some specs. This is running an 11th generation Intel Core i5-1135G7. And this is a fairly standard CPU used in laptops that's been out for a couple of years. It has integrated Iris Xe graphics and 16 gigs of RAM, but you can configure it up to 64 gigs. It has a single M.2 PCIe NVMe storage drive, and I have the lowest configuration of 256 gigs, but you can get it spec'd all the way up to 2 terabytes. It comes with 6 standard USB ports as well as a USB-C port, and it has dual 4K outputs in HDMI and DisplayPort. And finally, it has the standard Ethernet plug as well as Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. Alright, let's do a quick unboxing. Now this is my first time working with DroiX. They are a UK based shop, and so I've never really had the incentive to check them out. But they recently opened up a global store, and so now they ship all over the world. Now that being said, this model here that I tested was a prototype, and so in addition to testing and reviewing it, I also gave the company some feedback about some of the things that I saw and would like to see in the future. Now along those same lines, the fact that this is a prototype, it did have a couple rough edges. Primary among them was the fact that it came with a UK plug and not an American one. But luckily I had a matching plug that I could use instead. But inside, all I found were the power supply and then the Wi-Fi antennas and then some mounting screws as well. And luckily, here's that North American plug that I had already. And this won't be an issue for any of the retail units. Now for those wondering, this is a 65 watt power supply. Here are the specs. So let's take a look at the device itself. It's pretty small. It's about the same standard size of a mini PC. I'd say it's about 2.5 Kerrygold butters. It is 100% aluminum and has a nice subdued look to it. On the right, you can see there's a power button and some indicator lights. You also have a headphone microphone jack, 2 USB 2.0 ports, and 2 USB 3.0 ports. On each side, we have ventilation both above and below the fan. And then also on the bottom, we have an intake right here for the large fan that's at the bottom of the device. Now let's take a look at the back. So we have that power supply input here, gigabit Ethernet, USB 3.0, and then those dual 4K video outputs. Finally, we have a USB Type-C port on the back, and then a couple screws here to get into the device. So I think that's the first thing we'll do here. Let's go ahead and open up the top here and see what we're working with inside. And this just takes regular Phillips head screws. And to open it up, all you have to do is just kind of leverage your fingernail. And so this is what it looks like inside. You can see the RAM chips are face down. And then along the side, you can see the connectors for those larger Wi-Fi antennas. And below the hard drive slot, we can see the Wi-Fi chip. So let's take a deeper look and see what kind of components we're working with here. We'll start with the RAM. And I'm happy to report that they are using some legit RAM here. So mine came with 2 8GB DDR4 sticks rated at 3200 megahertz. Now let's check out that NVMe solid state drive, and as you can see here, it is from a company called KingSpec. I've never really used this company before, but I have seen them on Amazon. And as you can see, 256 gigs. And here's a look at that Wi-Fi chip. Like I mentioned, it is Wi-Fi 6 and Bluetooth 5.2. Now if I was feeling really frisky, I could probably pull this thing out and take a look at the fan and the heatsink, but honestly, I kind of don't want to mess with it. Either way, it's a solid feeling PC with kind of a bottom heavy feel to it, which I think is actually pretty nice. It feels very stable when it's sitting on those rubber feet. Okay, so I've put the mini PC back together, and so now let's install those Wi-Fi antennas. And honest truth, I've never actually worked with these antennas before. I've seen them around, but I've never actually had a PC with them. And honestly, it looks kind of cool. Like, I like the fact that it just feels like it has a lot more connectivity to it. And we'll test that here in a minute, but all the same, I don't actually dislike having these big antennas sticking out the back. And so here's what the device looks like here on my desk. I have a USB-C drive hooked up to it to have all my games and everything, but as you can see, yeah, it's a standard mini PC size. So now let's actually turn the thing on and start getting to it. We'll start by checking out the properties here, and yeah, as you can see here, 11th generation Core i5, and it has those 16 gigs of RAM, and it is running Windows 11 Pro. So first thing I want to do is check out some of the video playback and just see whether or not it can play at a true 4K, and I want to make special note of how many frames are dropped. And overall, it's actually really good. As you can see, the picture looks really nice, even though I am kind of downgrading this to 1080p when I output the video. And so I think if you wanted to use this mini PC as a media server, something like for Plex or things like that, I think it'll be just fine. In terms of using it as a home theater PC, it could also work, but I think that's a little bit overkill for the specs we have inside. Either way, when it comes to video playback, I think you'll have no problem here. So now let's do a torture test and see how it performs under pressure. And so I'm running at 100% load here using Prime 95, and as you can see, it's peaking at quite a high temperature. It's running at a max of about 28 watts altogether, but as you can see, core number 1 is actually peaking at about 94, 95 degrees, so it's running pretty hot. So I definitely think that's something we need to keep an eye on in the temperatures as we start playing games here later. Next, let's show off the fan noise. So here it is at 100% load. So it's not terrible, but definitely noticeable when it's on the desk. Next, let's talk about internet speed. So we'll start with Wi-Fi. So this is running off those 2 antennas just here at the house. And so I got 112 megabits per second download and 21.5 megabits upload. Now let's hook it up to Ethernet and do the same test, and actually they're just about equal. And so I think that's a great sign. If you happen to put this somewhere where you don't have access to an Ethernet cable, you don't really have to worry about it because the Wi-Fi speeds are just as good as they are when plugged into Ethernet. And that often is not the case with a lot of these mini PCs and their smaller antennas. And so in that regard, I think when it comes to doing things like Xbox game streaming or things like that, this is going to be a great PC. But that being said, this device is way more powerful than what you would need for game streaming. And so let's actually test out some gameplay now with PC games. As always, we're going to start with the easiest games first and then work our way up. And if you've never seen any of my videos, I do have a standard when I'm testing all of these games. I start at 1080p and then we'll typically do the default settings, but if there is an ability to turn it up to higher, I will also choose that. Only if a game does not run at the default settings at least 60 frames per second, then I will start messing with the settings and turning them down. And finally, if I'm not satisfied with the performance at that point, then I will downgrade it to 720p. And so this is kind of my way of testing what PC games will work and which ones won't. And as you can see here across the board, any of these 2D games or platformers or indie games, they're all running just fine. They're all at default settings, 1080p, absolutely no problem. When we get into 3D games and first-person shooters, things like Counter-Strike Go, we're getting between 75 and 90 frames per second on average. And so obviously if you're a diehard CSGO fan here, this is probably not going to be great for you, but it is pretty smooth and gives you an indication of the performance. I also tested out Hades and used a boss battle here so you can really see a lot of things going on. And the Proteus 11 here handled it like a champ, but do make note of the fact that even though the GPU and CPU are not maxed, the temperature here is still in the 90s, which is a little bit concerning. Okay, let's move up to something a little bit harder. Here is Halo 4 running at the default settings, which they call the original settings. And as you can see here, we're getting like 49, 50 frames per second. And so I'm going to go into settings here and change it from original to performance, which is their version of low. And now I'm getting between 50 and 60 frames, but the gameplay is a lot smoother. And so I would recommend using this setting if you do want to play the Master Chief Collection. Overall, I would say that these kind of middle tier first-person shooter games are going to be just fine on this device. So now let's check out Minecraft a little bit. So this is also running the default settings here. And as you can see, the frame rate's not great. You know, I'm getting dips down to like 45 frames per second, but often it is in the 50s. And I don't know anything about this game, and I have no idea if this is a good thing or not, but it seems pretty smooth to me despite having that lower frame rate. I also tested out this game Backbone, which I found on Xbox Game Pass. This one's pretty interesting. It's like a detective novel kind of thing. And surprisingly, it's kind of graphically intense despite not being like an action game. As you can see here, I averaged about 40 frames per second, but the gameplay was relatively smooth. Up next, we have Sonic and All-Stars Racing. Now this one by default runs at a high settings, and as you can see, it does have a hard time staying at 60 frames per second. But I found that as long as it's over 40, it's actually a relatively smooth experience. Moving up to something a little bit more modern, we have Resident Evil 3, and this one ran at an average between 35 and 45 frames per second. And for this, I did have to turn the graphics settings like all the way as low as I could. Now this is still at 1080p, but I would say this is playable at this preset. If you prefer having a higher frame rate, then I would recommend dropping it to 720p. Either way, I found this game to be playable. I would get a little bit of hiccup and slowdown when I would pan the camera every once in a while, but otherwise it was nice and smooth.
Hey, wait! Down here!
Now for Street Fighter V, I did drop this one down to 720p, and that's because I wanted to keep it at medium settings. I could do low settings at 1080p and it was relatively fine, but honestly I found that this game just looks terrible in low settings, so I would prefer to have it medium 720p. And finally, the last PC game I wanted to show off was Kill It With Fire. I was surprised to find that this one could not reach 30 frames per second. And so as a result, the gameplay was kind of choppy and not very enjoyable. Not only that, I didn't find this game enjoyable at all. I hate spiders and this thing just kind of freaked me out. I felt more like a horror game than anything. Anyway, that's it for PC gaming. Let's move on to emulation. I'm not really going to dig into the lower end stuff, let's just jump into the hard stuff. So here is PSP running at a 4x resolution, which is 1080p. And honestly, I probably only needed to test maybe 1 or 2 games. As long as I play God of War Chains of Olympus and maybe Outrun 2006, I usually know how well it's going to perform when it comes to PSP. But I gotta say, I was having such a good time testing these that I tested out way more games than I was expecting. And I think that's a good indication here that at 1080p, no matter what game you throw at it, it actually performed perfectly. Even God of War Chains of Olympus at 1080p 4x resolution would only slow down every once in a while, and it was usually when introducing a new move because it needed to compile the shader. But yeah, otherwise PSP was absolutely great on this. Okay, up next we had Nintendo GameCube. Now I also did a 3x resolution on this, which is also 1080p. And other than that, I kept everything at the default settings, so no tinkering here, and as you can see, it's working really well. Some of those middle tier games, like Super Mario Sunshine or X-Men Legends 2, absolutely no problem, they were playing really well. I was getting a weird issue where X-Men Legends 2 was showing a frame rate of less than 60, but it was perfectly smooth as I was playing it. In fact, these games were doing so well that I decided to just go the full Monty and test out some of the harder games. So here is F-Zero GX playing 100% fine at 1080p. And finally, here's also Rogue Leader, and as you can see, this one's running really well too. I got a few stutters and jitters there in the beginning as it was starting to kind of compile those shaders at first, but after that first minute or so, it was smooth sailing. And so, since those games were playing so well on GameCube, I decided to use those same settings of 1080p for Wii as well. And as you can see here, New Super Mario Bros. Wii, no problem. And same thing with Donkey Kong Country Returns. That's a really great sign. This is one of the harder Wii games to emulate properly. And even when you start moving up to that top tier of Wii games when it comes to emulation, things like Legend of Zelda Skyward Sword, still playing just fine at 1080p. I was really impressed. In fact, the only real issue I found with Nintendo Wii was Super Mario Galaxy 1 and 2. For some reason, it gave Mario like a really white face and his mustache disappeared. Now this might be something you can fix in the configuration settings, but it was just a little bit odd. But otherwise, the gameplay was nice and smooth for both games. And finally, I also installed Prime Hack, which is a fork of Dolphin, and I have a whole video about this. But as you can see, Metroid Prime Trilogy is looking fantastic. In addition to upscaling to 1080p, I'm also using HD textures as well. So yeah, I think when it comes to GameCube and Wii, this thing is great. Now let's move over to the PlayStation side, so we'll start with PS2. And again, like with the others, I kept this at 1080p and a 3x resolution. Now some of those easier games to emulate, things like Tekken 5 or Devil May Cry 3, absolutely no problem. When you get over to that middle tier of games, things like Grand Theft Auto 3, NBA 2K6, Metal Gear Solid 2, all of those were surprisingly good as well. I'll let them play out here for a minute.
Lips 106 is the home of the short hot mix.
Yeah. They get the first bucket. This could be a good contest.
Tosses it up. Bounces high, but falls through.
Freeze.
Now moving things up to that higher end, things like Ratchet & Clank, God of War 1, and God of War 2 also play just fine at 1080p. I was really impressed. In fact, the only game that had some issues was Need for Speed Most Wanted. This one I did have to downscale to 720p, and even then it wasn't at 100% full speed. I think a lot of it has to do with reflections on the car itself. I think that's just really hard for the CPU to handle. But either way, I would say that 90% of PS2 games are going to play just fine at 1080p. The others you may have to downgrade the resolution. So far so good. Let's move up to Xbox now, and unfortunately this is the one system that was the most disappointing to me. I played this at the original resolution, and even then it just couldn't really keep up. Halo Combat Evolved was mostly good, but it would dip down to something like 55 frames here and there. And then other games like Dead or Alive 3 and Soul Calibur 2, they were just basically unplayable. I would say they were running at about 2/3 speed, which is just kind of frustrating. So original Xbox, at least on the Windows side here, is not great. Okay, let's move up another generation. Let's try out Nintendo Wii U. Now on this, I kept everything at the native resolution, which is 720p for most Wii U games. And other than that, I didn't make any other configuration changes, and as you can see, it's running really well. Mario Kart 8 runs super good, and Splatoon actually works really well too. And same story with Super Mario 3D World. And so at that point, most games are going to be pretty good on Wii U here. But of course, the one you always got to check is Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. And surprisingly, the gameplay on this was pretty decent. I'm getting about 45, maybe 50 frames per second here in 720p. And sure, that's not 60 frames or anything, but man, is it nice and smooth, and it still looks really good. I think the art style in this game in particular just kind of is more lenient when it comes to these lower resolutions. And so, Breath of the Wild 720p, totally playable. Okay, now let's move over to PlayStation 3. Again, I'm going to play everything at the native resolution, which was typically 720p as well. And I gotta say, the performance for PS3 was kind of a mixed bag. Some of those middle tier games, things like Demon's Soul, played at full speed. This was originally a 30 FPS game. Now DMC was also a 30 FPS game, but as you can see here, it cannot reach that limit. And unfortunately, it's the same case with Prince of Persia. Once you get into the open world like this, it really drops down to like 15 frames per second. Now the gameplay speed is still pretty decent, it's actually running at relatively full speed, but it does result in a choppy gameplay experience, as you can see when I move the camera back and forth. And then also make note of the fact that the CPU is basically getting bottlenecked here. It's running at about 98%, and that temperature is getting up to 95 degrees Celsius as well internally. And so when it comes to PS3 gameplay in particular, this thing is really kind of chugging and it just isn't doing very well. And so I think my assessment here is going to be that PS3 is somewhat playable, but I wouldn't count on this device to be a PS3 emulating machine. Okay, two more systems to test. We're going to start with 3DS next. Now for this one, I ran it at a 2x resolution, and across the board, almost every game played just fine. Mario Kart 7 is usually a good indication. If this one plays well, then 3/4 of the games are usually going to play okay. Now I also tried out Super Smash Bros. 3DS, and I have no idea how to play this game, but it is running at a relatively smooth frame rate. It would definitely dip below 60, but overall the stutters and whatnot were very minimal. I also tried a Pokemon game, so Pokemon Sun did also play at a 60 frames per second speed. So if you do want to play this game at a double resolution, this is going to be a pretty good option. The only 3DS game that gave me some hiccups was actually Super Mario 3D Land. This one still had a relatively good speed and everything, but it would have some hiccups and stutters when it dropped down to like 50 frames per second. And so overall, it just kind of made it a jerky gameplay experience. And finally, on the Windows side, I wanted to test Nintendo Switch. Now unfortunately, I think that this is probably the upper limit of the device. The performance here was a lot like how it is on the PS3. So in that regard, yes, it's not going to give you a solid 60 frames per second, but the gameplay is relatively smooth for a lot of games. A good example of that is Kirby and the Forgotten Land. This one would average maybe 20-25 frames per second, and it's supposed to run at 30 frames per second normally. But you know, even though the frame rate is well below the standard, it's still relatively playable. I don't think I would really enjoy playing these games at this speed, but I'm pretty sure I could hand this off to my 6-year-old and he wouldn't notice the difference. And so in that regard, yeah, I don't really think that this is a Switch emulating machine either, but a good portion of the games will be relatively playable. Other games, like Link's Awakening, are just definitely unplayable. They're very slow and jerky and just have those hiccups to them. And so Nintendo Switch is not awesome on this, but it is workable in some capacity. Okay, next we're going to test out Linux operating system using Batocera. Now one thing to note here, the manufacturer has it set so that secure boot is enabled, What that means is you're not going to be able to boot into a flash drive like one that's loaded with Batocera. So what you'll have to do is start up the device, press F2 to get into the BIOS, and then go into the security tab, and then under secure boot, just go ahead and disable that. Then in the boot tab, you're going to want to go into the boot priority and then make it so that the USB flash drive is boot priority number 1. After that, when you plug in the flash drive and then power the device on, it'll boot automatically into Batocera. Now I've talked about this operating system ad nauseum at this point, but it is one of my favorite for retro gaming. And by virtue of being a Linux-based operating system, sometimes some systems will play better on this than on Windows. So first I decided to test something we hadn't shown before, and so here is Sega Dreamcast, and this is running just fine in Batocera through RetroArch at 1080p. In fact, as you can see from the CPU load here, this system is barely working in order to get this 1080p anyway. And so if you have a 4K TV, for example, you could bump that up beyond that. And the other thing I found to my delight is that Xbox plays really well on the Batocera side. In fact, here I am playing at a 2x resolution, so double what we were trying on Windows, and it's way more smooth than it was on the Windows emulator. I wouldn't go so far as to say that every single game is going to play at 60 frames per second, but I'd be confident in saying that as long as the emulator does an accurate job of emulating these games, they should play pretty good. Now, of course, remember, when you're done using Batocera, you'll have to go back into the BIOS and then turn on the secure boot in order to get back into Windows. And then also go into that boot tab and change the boot priority as well. Okay, before we start wrapping up, I do want to spend a couple minutes talking about price. And I'm just going to pull these prices directly from their website here based on what I find as of today. And if I go into the DroiX global store, as you can see, the low spec model, which is the one I tested here, runs at $644 before shipping. Now the mini PC here is configurable, so if you wanted to have the i7 version of this processor, you could bump that up for about $60, $70. And you could also totally deck this thing out with 64 gigs of RAM and 2 terabytes of storage, but it is going to cost you upwards of $1,200. But going back to that original price, the one that I'm testing here, $644 is the standard, and then I think it's something like $20 to $40 for shipping depending on the speed. Now, if we go to Amazon and look at that same chipset, you can see other devices that have the same chip that are around the same price. And so this B-Link GTI, which I actually reviewed on this channel a few months ago, it runs for $680 with a $40 coupon, so a little bit cheaper. And if you want to try out some other companies too, on Amazon I did find some others. For example, this one is $585 with a $90 coupon, so under $500. And going even further, you could go on AliExpress and get one of these no-name Chinese versions, which honestly look a lot like the DroiX one, and this also will be under $500. And so going back to the one we're reviewing here, which is the Proteus 11, yes, it's about $140, $150 more expensive than the absolute cheapest one you could find on the internet. And so I actually brought this up with the company. I said, hey, you know, this is a little bit more expensive. And they actually made a good point, and that is the fact that they really take care of their customers. Anyone I've heard of who has used DroiX before sings nothing but praise about their customer service. And honestly, some of the proof is in the pudding. For example, on their website alone, they have a forum which you can go in and ask questions and get answers. But they also have a knowledge base based on the various things that they sell. And so you can go into the mini PC section and they have tutorials and videos on how to do all sorts of things. For example, how to install and update drivers or the operating system. And on top of that, they also have a blog which they update almost every single day. And they cover various aspects, including reviews of devices, but then also tutorials in here as well. And I gotta be honest, I've used some of these tutorials myself. And finally, the other thing that I really have appreciated about DroiX is how responsive they are. They will generally answer my emails in just a couple hours. And as you can see here, they have a phone number with store hours, so you can just call them and get a response right then. But even then, their email response time to customers is 2 to 5 hours during the week, and they'll even get back to you within 24 hours on a weekend. And so I think from a customer service perspective, that's something that you're not going to find anywhere else. But I'm kind of getting ahead of myself right here with my conclusions, so let's jump into my likes and dislikes first. And so let's start by talking about the things I like. Number one, this has some pretty decent gaming. On the PC side, most games played at 1080p, although I did have to lower the resolution. And obviously things like Cyberpunk are probably not going to run very well, but still I would say the PC gaming performance here for a mini PC is well above average. On top of that, the emulation up to Wii U was fantastic. It started to get a little bit sketchy when you got past that to things like PS3 and Switch, but for me the golden age was PS2 and GameCube, and so in that regard this can eat through it like nothing. I also appreciate the fact that they have nice components in here, and I ended up really liking those Wi-Fi antennas. And like I said before, if you don't have access to plugging in this thing via Ethernet, the Wi-Fi antennas just kind of take all of that out of consideration. And finally, like we just talked about, that DroiX customer support is something that is valuable. The way I see it, if you are looking into getting a mini PC for the first time, I think the peace of mind that you can get from buying something like this from DroiX is going to be a lot better than just some no-name brand out of AliExpress. And bear in mind too that DroiX sells other mini PCs and they provide support for those as well. So if this one in particular is not the one that floats your boat, there might be something else on their website. And so kind of the way I see it, if you know your way around a mini PC and you just kind of want to have one for convenience, then I think there's probably no big risk in trying out something from AliExpress or from Amazon. Meanwhile, if you're just getting your feet wet and you want to make sure that you have somebody to call when something goes wrong, this might be a way to go. Okay, I feel like I'm heaping praise on this company at this point, so let's talk about the things I don't like about this mini PC. To start, I'm a little disappointed it doesn't have a hard drive expansion slot within the device. I think an additional M.2 expansion slot would have been perfect, but even a SATA connection for a 2.5-inch drive would have been great too. Now, this is also something I brought up with the company, and they did say they are planning on putting that in the next device iteration that they make. So other things I didn't like about the device, the fan noise on this was noticeable. It wasn't something that I found annoying, but it was definitely something I noticed when I had it on my desk. And that isn't always the case with other mini PCs. And like we saw, I was a little bit disappointed in the Xbox emulation on the Windows side. Thankfully, the Batocera version ran really well, but it would have been even nicer if everything played really well in Windows. Next, as we saw, the thermal performance on this was a little bit below average. I really wasn't expecting to see temperatures in the 90 degrees, but more often than not, that's where I actually saw the readout in MSI Afterburner. And so that does give me a little bit pause when it comes to longevity. If you're going to be playing this thing for years and years, those 90-degree temperatures may shorten the lifespan of this device. And finally, no bones about it, that price is a little bit higher than the competition. Now, I've already spent some time talking about why that price is probably a little bit understandable, given the fact that they are paying for people to be customer service representatives and to give that great quality of care. Obviously, that's not something you can really expect from some of the other China-based companies, but I think that's where the price difference comes in. And so, at the end of the day, how do I feel about the DroiX Proteus 11? Well, I think the performance on this was pretty decent. It is a little bit on the expensive side, but I think for those who are looking for a mini PC, but don't really know how to get their feet wet, I think this might be a good way to go. However, if you know your way around a PC, then you might be able to get something cheaper and then take on that risk. And of course, if you're an expert in PCs and all that other kind of stuff, you're probably not going to want a mini PC anyway, you're just going to build your own. Anyway, that's one of the cool things about this whole kind of environment is that there's lots of options. And my hope here is that this video has helped you narrow down those options a little bit more. And so please let me know if you have any questions in the comments below, and as always, thank you for watching. Be sure to like and subscribe if you found this helpful, and we will see you next time. Happy gaming.